So, welcome everybody. My name is Michael Gurney. I'll be the head adjudicator for this debate. Before I start, I'd just like to go through a few technicalities. I know, well, this is the first time we've done anything like this, an online virtual debate, and I'd just like all of you participants and audience to please just sort of bear with us because this is all incredibly new to us and we may have some technical difficulties going along the way. So I just ask you please to be patient in that regard. Secondly, the participants will be communicating with each other over WhatsApp while some are speaking, while a speaker is speaking, and that's quite a common debating topic, debating technique. So I just like you please not to consider that as being rude because it's more just a way to get across points that you think you'll use in your next speech. So this debate, the topic is this House would implement universal basic income, and the first proposition speaker is going to define a bit more of that. Proposing the motion will be Kwande Dhlomo, Simon Vieux, and Reuben Baldry. And opposing the motion will be Jason Makhele, Ross Keep, and Jadin. Our chairman today will be Freddie Waller, and our timekeeper, Maya Nene. And the adjudicators, me and Mr. Richard Brown.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The motion before the floor today is this House would implement universal basic income. I would now like to ask Kwande Dhlomo to take the floor.
We live in a country where poverty and inequality are common. And while over the years we have made a valiant effort to counteract this, it is simply not enough. Good afternoon, adjudicators, timekeepers, chairman, and the floor at large. My name is Kwande Dhlomo, and I will be Side Proposition's first speaker for today's debate. The motion at hand is this House would implement universal basic income. We define universal basic income as a welfare system where all citizens, whether employed or unemployed in a given country, are allocated basic income sufficient for acquiring basic needs. And we define basic needs as essential needs for human survivability. So an example, food, clothing, and sanitation. We set the parameters of this debate to South Africa. And our burden of proof is twofold. Firstly, we would like to prove that UBI is better than the current welfare system within South Africa. And secondly, that it has numerous benefits that outweigh any possible harms, therefore increasing a general level of well-being within our country. To understand this, we have developed a criteria of when we should change government policies or models. And to this, we say we change them when they have not been working for an extended amount of time. The case split will go as follows. I'll speak about the current situation that we as South Africa in and contextualize it, as well as the removal of desperation UBI provides for citizens. My second speaker, Simon, will then speak about the effect that UBI will have on unemployment, as well as the morality of a government to do something. As far as implementation goes, all people within a country are beneficiaries of UBI, which is calculated on the spending necessary to afford basic needs. The income is unconditional and goes by a headcount basis. The money used for implementing a UBI will be repurposed from already existing social welfare grants, as well as from taxpayers. Similarly to current social security systems, the money for each citizen can be collected from offices set up like how the SASSA in every district of every province, within or through the company by which you're employed, where the individual grant for each citizen is paid for by the government to the company and then to you. We also understand that UBI is a largely conceptual idea, so therefore we'd like to push on up to argue this more than just implementation, but on a principle level. And now into my matter. My first point is that the system needs to change. It is necessary for us to contextualize the current situation South Africa is facing. So allow me to set the scene. As I mentioned earlier, our country is one that is filled with impoverishment. This obviously being because of the lack of opportunity given to the majority of the population in the past. This was addressed as early as 1997, where the White Paper for Social Welfare declared the introduction of social grants. Currently today, there are an estimate of 19 million beneficiaries of the numerous different social grants. Yet the amount of people struggling day to day and the amount of people who are unemployed are still extremely high. And this act of social welfare has been instated for over 23 years. Now, we acknowledge that other policies, such as acts that attempt to reform educational structures in rural areas and focus on the development of people, are key. But the grants that have been in place to attempt to alleviate the pressure are doing no such thing. Therefore, adhering to our criteria that we placed earlier about changing government models when it has not worked for an extended amount of time. Even if you still dispute the need for change, the white paper for social welfare itself admitted that, and I quote, South Africa has embarked on an arduous task of socio-political and economic reform. While sound economic policies and well-functioning labor markets are essential for growth and employment generation, by themselves, they are not sufficient. To reap benefits, South Africa must invest in people, that is, develop the human capital, which is essential for increasing productivity and moving people out of poverty. On this note, I'd like to move to my second point, how UBI does this through the removal of desperation. Now, desperation is something that plagues the lives of so many who are struggling, and is also one of the factors that stunts the development of people. You cannot stop looking for a job and in return to learn skills that fit the current labor market under this current system. You are desperate, and the monetary assistance gained from social welfare grants is simply not enough, assuming that one would qualify for one in the first place. Whereas
Point of information.
Out of order. UBI provides the safety net for people to get the opportunity to take time and gain skills. This is applicable in so many real-life situations. Firstly, like the exploitation of workers. You are no longer in desperate need of supporting yourself, so therefore you don't have to take jobs from people who are only willing to pay you under the minimum wage, like a lot of farm workers. Just domestic abuse or gender-based violence. Quite often people endure relationships for an extended amount of time because they're not financially independent and cannot live a sustainable life without the abusive partner. Now, we're not saying at all that if you inherit UBI, will you be able to live a free life, a life that's full of benefits, but it will give you a place to start. UBI works as a way to support people in need, allow time for development of school, and increase the level of well-being of all citizens. If you do not stand for this, then you do not stand for our people. This is why I cannot be prouder to propose. Thank you.
I would now like to ask opposition first speaker, Jason Makhele, to take the floor.
The utopian fairy tale with no basis in reality, which could result in inflation, the decreasing labor force participation, and a failed, risky experiment that would not raise the standards of living, but rather put a South African's economy and its people in a much worse state. Good afternoon, adjudicators, side proposition, ladies and gentlemen, and the floor at large. My name is Jason Timothy Makhele, and I'll be side opposition's first speaker. The topic before us today is this House would implement universal basic income. We as side opposition accept the parameters and definitions brought forward by side proposition's first speaker. And today I'll be saying our case split and then going on to our burden of proof. So for today, I'll be talking about how the universal basic income can't solve the challenges of South Africa's poverty and how ineffective implementation of the universal basic income is in South Africa specifically. And my second speaker, Ross Keep, will speak about the rebuttal on the policy of side propositions and on how targeted money allocation will be better. While my third speaker, Jadin, will do rebuttal and elaborate on the points that my second speaker and myself speak about. Now onto our burden of proof for today's debate. Universal basic income is an idea which is not economically feasible and advocates for the loss of freedom, ending in economic and social distress, which could be averted by better target money allocation. And now onto my rebuttal before I start my speech. I'd just like to speak about side proposition's first point, or not their first point, but side proposition failed to provide us with a clear and a well-thought policy and failed to provide us with details about how they would obtain money to sustain everyone in the country and how they would implement their plan. And they failed to mention how much people would be paid. Thank you. Now, on to my first point, which is how universal basic income can't solve the challenges of South Africa's poverty. Universal basic income is side proposition's idea that everyone would receive money each month from the government to pay for people's basic needs, including food and housing. If you look at South Africa specifically, we already have this to some extent. People who make less money get subsidized through tax breaks. So if you make less money, you pay fewer taxes. We also have social welfare programs which help people in need. When we review the extensive social welfare grants that South Africa has in place, these grants are given on a monthly basis and are well targeted at very poor households. and that they have been central to poverty. Whereas in the universal basic income, these untargeted cash grants are being led to waste. There is no process of reviewing one's economic status, but rather free sums of money being given to those with more than enough, which also adds to the concern of South Africa's spending on social welfare, not sustainable in the long term. If we go down this path, the South African untargeted grants that people receive will still result in the lack of food, the scarce shelter, and the poor hygiene for people who are poverty-stricken. Because the grants are used inefficiently, and with the same use of resources, we can target the money in a better way to be more effective. The current South African social welfare system is, in other words, a small built basic income, where thousands are issued grants. These grants are ineffective and have not provided the economic stimulus to pull the people out of poverty. Thus, providing information about such a small scale of basic income is not enough. It won't work on a larger scale. Side proposition ignores the fact that people are already getting money on a social welfare grants and nothing has happened. Therefore, implementing the universal basic income won't provide the lower class peoples of South Africa with adequate basic needs for everyone. Creating a large scale of what already is flawed won't solve the issue. And to add, the side proposition's idea for basic income appears to be giving money to the people who don't really need the money. We as side proposition propose a more sustainable and greater initiative, which would be to concentrate that same amount of money on a smaller amount of poorer people, which rather than already giving money to people that already have more than enough. My second speaker, Ross Keep, will go into more information about how targeted money allocation will be better. And now on to my second point, which is the ineffective implementation. What is new about the idea of universal basic income and what side proposition proposed is that it sets this new level of support. And so side proposition is essentially saying that South Africa is wealthy enough as a society to make sure that nobody goes hungry and nobody is homeless. Another flaw in side proposition's theory of this is that the introduction of universal basic income first boils down to the feasibility. We see that universal basic income would need trillions in order to start. And in the country where 17 million working adults, 6 million unemployed people, and South Africa's 2.8 trillion debt, the question is, how will side proposition fund the universal basic income? The answer, they can't. Universal basic income cannot be financed with government debt or newly printed currency, and sacrificing all other social programs for the sake of a universal basic income is a grave idea. Attempting to fund this idea in South Africa will consume all of the tax revenue that the government collects and much more. If you look at an example in Finland, which was the first country to test a government-backed basic income, the results were substandard, and the research concluded that 1, inflation would be triggered because of the increase in demand for goods and services. 2, there wasn't an increase in standard of living in the long run because of inflated prices. And 3, a reduced program with smaller payments won't make a real difference to poverty-stricken families. And on top of that, the government still didn't have enough money to fully fund a small project. So to conclude, side proposition is essentially saying that we must remove the concern of survival from every person's life. And we as side opposition believe that we have to come back to the fundamental concept of economic activity. One should always be wary of simple solutions to complex problems, and the universal basic income is no exemption. When you look at the next 100 years and find that tremendous value still needs to be created, our current economic is still very relevant. Thank you.
Okay, are we ready? Good afternoon, adjudicators, timekeepers, and the floor at large. Today, I would like to begin with some rebuttal on Jason's points, and then I will go down to my substantial matter. So one of Jason's opening statements was that the money would be given to people who don't actually need it, but actually the money would increase the purchasing power parity of the lower people, which is 50% of South Africa's population earning 1,200 a month. It would give them more money, and they can use that to actually spend more money in the economy and drive up business. He also said that these people will be receiving social grants, but he did not take in mind that social grants are only given to the most extreme cases. And if you're earning just minimum wage, you will not qualify for a social grant, which means if you need to buy something like a fridge, which is a lot of money, you will not be able to afford it. And as Kwande brought up, I'd like to reiterate that we would be able to afford it if we redistributed the money that has not been uplifting the people of South Africa and has not been for a long period of time. I will begin. Throughout history, there have been people that are poor. Today is no different, and the future will be the same as well. 41% of people living in sub-Saharan Africa are below the poverty line, And to bring it closer to home, 49.2% of South Africans are below the upper bound poverty line of 1,200 Rand per month as of 2019. Now, unemployment, as we may well know, is 28.7% as of last December. But given the current coronavirus situation, they're expected to reach 35.5% at the end of this year. For some with social grants, they may be okay. The government will grant a whopping 350 Rand for coronavirus job loss relief. But many jobless South Africans are in need of something more, a fixed and reliable income to give them basic needs. We owe them that much. My first point is that unemployment will never reach zero. Workers are always coming and going looking for better jobs. In the current world situation, they may be being laid off, and South Africa's structural unemployment is a problem. The latter occurs when people do not have the right skills for the jobs that the economy can offer and through no fault of their own cannot work. This is where UBI would come in.
Point of information.
Yes.
Should we rather not just spend then all of our income and government expenditure on those unemployed people rather than implementing a basic income for the entire country where we could focus our expenditure on the people who are really in need?
Giving the basic income to the upper classes who may not need it as much does not matter because it'll just be pumped back into the economy through their taxes and they'll spend that money on food. Now I'll carry on with my speech. It would provide everyone, and especially those that are currently unemployed, with their own income. They will have food, water, and shelter guaranteed, making their time looking for work easier. Because how can you look for work if you do not have your basic needs? They would also have the chance to use the money to try and learn new skills to fit into the current...
Point of information.
No, thank you. For example, they could learn to lay bricks if there are jobs available in construction at the time. Even if there are still no jobs available, they would have their own income, giving them a stable life. So UBI will give people time to catch their breath and start learning to do different jobs, or otherwise it'll just allow them to have their basic needs covered. If you've lost your job unexpectedly, perhaps because of a situation like coronavirus, UBI would cover your basic needs. Now I'll move on to discuss how it is ethically right to implement UBI. People below the poverty line, i.e. 50% of South Africans, and even the high 35.5% of predicted unemployment, need some sort of government assistance. So UBI will help them stay on their feet and will take the stress off of getting basic needs such as food and water. It is not right to allow half of the population to only live off 1,200 Rand a month. 35% of South Africans are below the food poverty line, which is 540.
Point of information.
No, thank you. UBI would allow them to have basic needs. As South Africans, do we not owe it to them? Do they not deserve an income that is constant? These are our lives. We may only live up to 50 years. So let's make their lives more than just a day-to-day food struggle, and let's give them a better standard of living. The government can repurpose funding that isn't working, as Kwande brought up. We could truly care for our people. Imagine the misty-eyed gentleman in ragged clothes who begs for money at a stop street in Pietermaritzburg. After UBI, you may well see him in clean clothes walking into Checkers to buy food with money that comes from UBI every month and enough for basic needs. Thank you.
I would now like to ask PASCO's second speaker, Ross Keep, to take the floor.
The universal basic income that side proposition proposes is one that is unsustainable, and it is not the most effective use of resources that the government has at its disposal. By implementing a more effective use of money the government already has, we can create greater change than what is proposed by side proposition. Good afternoon, adjudicators, chairman, side proposition at the floor is at large. My name is Ross Keep, and I will be second speaker for side opposition in today's debate. I would like to start off with some rebuttal and then move on to my substantive matter. So firstly, I would like to start off with the flaws in your policy, which I will highlight. In order to have an actual shot at implementing universal basic income in South Africa, we need to understand if it is sustainable and manageable or not, and if we have the funds to do so. Looking at it in a theoretical view is not what this debate is about. It is about implementing it in South Africa. So when they raised their capital fund issue, how they would raise the money to spend on the economy, they mentioned increasing taxes, but this comes with a host of issues like capital flight and the Laffer curve, in which when the tax rates are increased, government revenue starts to decrease, and capital flights in which
Information.
no, thank you, in which the rich people start to leave South Africa for better jobs or external finance. Other ways in which you can raise taxes don't work, such as VAT, because then you'll be harming the people who you seek to help. And then they actually fail to say any specific amount per month, and they fail to highlight any form of funding other than relocating the current budget we have. But with the current budget we have, we could repurpose the grants of 350 billion rand, but the universal basic income that side proposition are proposing costs 1,200 rand a month, which calculates to 800 billion rand. Now I'd like to get on to some issued rebuttal on the speakers. The first speaker pointed out that cash grants do not currently work. So what makes you think that by giving more widespread cash grants and by increasing them, you'll yield different results? And now onto the second speaker's point that unemployment will never reach zero. The fact that unemployment will never reach zero is an illogical argument. What they fail to understand is that it is a wasteful use of resources. It is like saying that if there are 100 people and only 3 are starving, we should feed everybody the same amount of food. We should rather concentrate our resources on the 3 people in need. As I will mention later, targeted grants are more effective than widespread cash grants. Now, onto my first point, which is the logistics of South Africa. The upper bound poverty line, which coincides with the definition of the conditions of side proposition's UBI proposal, is set out in South Africa at 1,227 rands per month. This figure was calculated by the South African government. By implementing UBI at this rate, it would cost the government around 800 billion rand per annum in expenditure. This is nearly triple the current social grants allocation for the 2020-2020 budget and almost half of our entire government expenditure. UBI in South Africa is simply impossible on the expenditure part. South Africa lacks the significant amount of money required to implement a system of UBI. While there is no doubt that cash grants benefit the people of South Africa, it would be far more efficient for the government to target appropriate cash grants to citizens in need in order to create the economic stimulus which will develop our nation's economic state. For example, in a study set out by MIT Economics Department, they found that when giving a capital injection of $200 to micro entrepreneurs in Sri Lanka, it yielded a return on capital of 5.85% monthly. Similarly, in Ghana, cash grants of $120 were given to micro entrepreneurs, and they subsequently increased sales revenue of approximately 15% per month. What I'm getting at is that UBI is not a solution to solving the problem, but it is putting a plaster on the wound. As my first speaker pointed out, a large percent of our nation is already on grants, and these have not yielded the results you speak of in your proposal. Through the use of more effectively targeted grants and allocation of resources, we could create the economic stimulus that the country desperately needs. We want to push South Africa into a time of economic prosperity with the aid of the government and cash handouts, in the form of universal basic income is not the solution. One should be wary of simple solutions to complex problems, and universal basic income is no exception. The fact that this answer to poverty and unemployment has been met with such enthusiasm indicates a breakdown not in the economic system, but in democratic politics and civic life. If side proposition believe it would be so easy to implement a system of UBI, why haven't we done it before, and why haven't we lifted these millions of people out of poverty? The reason is we do not have the resources, and we do not have the money, and we do not use the resources at our disposal in the correct manner. Thank you.
I would now like to ask West's third speaker, Reuben Baldry, to take the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Reuben Baldry, and I'm the third speaker for side proposition today. I would like, in my speech, I'll be substantiating some of the points made by Simon and Kwande, and I will also be engaging in some rebuttal on the points put forward by side opposition. Now, what we aim to do is to provide a safety net for the people of South Africa, as Kwande said. This universal basic income would provide a starting point for the people to build their lives so they don't have to worry about basic things like food and shelter every day. Instead, they can focus their time more productively on getting jobs and providing for their families in a more effective way. Now, side opposition, as of yet, has so far told us that UBI would be impossible to implement. They've also told us that social grants are not an effective way of doing it, and they haven't failed to provide us with an alternative. So the way I see it, universal basic income would be a much more effective solution than social grants, because side opposition even said thousands are issued grants, but thousands is not enough. As my second speaker, Simon, said, 49.2% of South Africans are underneath the poverty line, and that equates to a lot more than thousands of people. So if you really want to look after the... yes, please.
Reuben, we would all love to live in a utopia in which everybody is lifted out of poverty with free cash grants, but what I have explained is that we simply do not have the resources to implement this, and you have failed to respond or rebut on that point.
Okay, as we said, I would just like to highlight one of the points Kwande made here, and he said that the money going towards the rich people who don't need it necessarily, as you say, would be put back into the economy in terms of they would be spending more, and that would boost the economy itself. Now, once again, I would just like to also highlight that you have also not provided an alternative
information.
Basic income. No, thank you. You also put forward an example, and it was, if there are 100 people and 3 people are starving, we should focus on the 3 starving people. Now, first of all, that example is clearly not no, thank you, as what is happening in South Africa, because once again, almost 50% of South Africans are beneath this
information
poverty line. Yes.
My point still stands, because we should focus the resources on those 50 people who are starving instead of implementing it widespread to everybody. We should focus our resources on the people who really need it.
Okay, and here's why that's not going to work. Currently, we have a system that is sort of meant to work in that way, and that is the system of social grants. These grants are provided to certain people under certain conditions who apply for them. Now, the problem is these grants are only applicable to people in very specific situations. If someone is making barely above minimum wage, as Simon said, they may not be applicable for a social grant. This means that they do not have that safety net that universal basic income would provide them with. Now, if we provided everyone with universal basic income, we would not be excluding those situations, because those people are also in need of this
Point of information.
Yes.
How would you ensure or how would you monitor the means in which they go about getting these basic needs, etc.?
Well, you see, what people don't realize is that people in poverty are not going to just spend the money that they're given through this universal basic income. They're not going to spend it and waste it. They are actually going to use it for survivability. You see, the reason we want to implement this is because these people cannot afford these basic needs. This universal basic income, no thank you, with a way of affording those. Now, you also said it's like putting a plaster on a wound, but currently this wound has nothing covering it and is bleeding freely. Universal basic income is the only way that we could truly stop the poverty. Yes.
Surely we're just adding salt to the wound now if we're using a system such as UBI that we haven't tested before and we don't know it works. What is your answer to that?
Well, how can you prove that it's not going to work if you haven't tried it, as you say? That argument can work both ways. Now, as we've pointed out now, universal basic income is far superior to a system of social grants because it would not be excluding those niche situations where certain people who are desperately in need of funding would not be able to survive. And for these points that we have put forward, myself, Simon, and Kwande, I could not be prouder to propose this motion.
I would now like to ask PASCO's speaker, Jordaan, to address the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, clearly we live in a utopian world, as side proposition would like to see it as. There's a word us as side opposition would like to bring forward to them, which is known as reality. Something we live in at the moment and something which side proposition have not come up and have not realized whatsoever. You see, our team line as side opposition has been one that stands and still stands proudly. It includes the following. One should always be wary of simple solution to complex problems, and universal basic income is no exception. The fact that this answer to poverty and unemployment has been met with such enthusiasm on their side indicates a breakdown not only in their economic system, but in democratic politics and civic life. Our burden of proof as side opposition has been one that still stands proudly, which unfortunately side proposition have not been able to spot any flaws in whatsoever. Our burden of proof is the universal basic income is an idea that is not economically feasible and advocates for a loss of freedom, as well as a rising of inflation, ending in the economy and social distress, which could be averted by better target money allocation. My name is Jadin. I'm third speaker for side opposition that stands proudly in today's debate. My first two speakers, Jason and Ross Keep, mentioned the following points of how universal basic income can't solve SA's poverty, how ineffective the implementation of UBI actually is. Ross Keep further went on to mention the logistics of South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're still standing on the side of proposition, you're standing in a utopian world which does not realize what reality is in the midst of this. They kept on They kept on speaking about history and how history has proven to us that there's been many people that have been poor and etc. But let me show you what history has taught us as side opposition. History has taught us the following. Many clever minds out there, such as Thomas Paine, said in 1797 that payment made to every person, rich or poor, would be the way to go. Martin Luther King Jr. carried on in 1967, and he said guaranteed income pegged to the median of society is what we need. Milton Friedman said negative income tax reduced the present bureaucracy. Now, let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, hear me out. What exactly does this show us? Some of the best minds in history have chosen and have thought about UBI in their lifetime. Now, why exactly have they not tested it or tried this out? Because these great minds have realized that this is an impossible trait which cannot be carried forward in the world today. You see, Finland are experimenting such a thing at this moment as we speak. They are paying their members $250 per month. What does this show us in their country? That they end up paying $3.5 billion per month to their people. Now, what would this mean for South Africa's government as we use the parameters of South Africa? We clearly know we're a third world country that currently sits in junk status amid the coronavirus. How exactly do you expect a government that is struggling with these payouts, such as social grants, to now go ahead and implement UBI? You see, this is a policy debate, hence the House would. Unfortunately, side proposition have come up here today and have not given us a stable policy in indicating how exactly they're going to go about applying this UBI. How much money they're going to give their members, and what exactly they're going to do in these terms. Now, let me ask you a simple question from side opposition to side proposition. Have you, in any case, thought about the following things? How well off is the country in which you're implementing this? Are things like high taxes and cutting budget politically acceptable in our country? And how much welfare is put in place and is ineffective, which you so-called going to replace?
Point of information.
No, thank you. The only way to do this successfully is to replace welfare and use the profits thereof to feed it. Now, tell me what. If we replace profit as South Africa and use this UBI to feed the people and to help them in a matter, does it not mean that we'll make the rich richer and the poor poorer, essentially, as inflation rates will rise higher and higher and higher before? We clearly have... No, thank you. Clearly, I've mentioned that you haven't responded to lack of funding whatsoever. Our first, second, and myself have reiterated this aspect over and over again, and clearly you've shown us that you have no term and no means to bring feedback to this. History proves this to us. Are you telling me that your policy somehow promotes the utmost level of communism in which we bring people together by providing them the same means and the same payments in all of, like, as history has shown us? Tsar Alexander II showed us this as he implemented an Emancipation Act. Now, what exactly does this Emancipation Act show us? That it showed us that if we give people who are currently not receiving the amount of money that we provide them in this UBI that you so-called want to provide them, what will end up happening? More than half will end up not being able to bring a valuable feedback or response to this money that they are getting. This does not mean, and you haven't told us how exactly you're going to go about preventing these people from going to do and pay and use things or buy things such as alcohol, drugs, etc. At the end of the day, some people in poverty, we need to realize that this isn't a utopian world, and we can't always be optimistic about things like this. We need to take everyone we can't take anyone for granted, and we need to take everyone into consideration on these matters. You see, Steven Pinker, one of the best historians of all time and thinkers, came up with the blank slate, and he took, and you guys clearly haven't taken this into consideration. He said that under the UBI, everyone essentially receives the same goods and services regardless of how hard they work. You see, this is what my first and second speaker have mentioned and gone on about. So if you stand in a utopian world where everything seems unrealistic and you do not know the real means of realism, then clearly you stand on the side of side proposition. But if you stand in a world that we want to better for the good, you'll stand as side opposition and you'll stand proudly. Therefore, this house must fall and must fall proudly. Thank you.
I would now like opposition Pasco to provide their reply speech.
I welcome you again, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be your reply speaker for side opposition, and I'll speak proudly here today, knowing that we have the most positive case and spotted the flaws within the policy of side proposition. Now, what have we said in this debate that has carried through from our first to our last speaker that side proposition hasn't been able to spot? That is quite simple. It has been funding. We've kept on asking numerous times in numerous POIs how exactly they're going to answer these questions, how exactly they're going to cope with the resources that they have in South Africa as a whole, and how as a third world country we are meant to implement this to our people, where almost more than half of people are in poverty at this moment. If you stand in an unrealistic world, such as side proposition, where you do not know the true meaning behind the UBI and how devastating this catastrophe can actually end up being, then please stand proudly with side proposition. But if you believe in a world where we can use this money in a better scenario, such as giving or increasing or bettering social grants in a practical manner that we know does work, you would proudly stand with side opposition and you'd proudly note that UBI isn't the answer for tomorrow. Thank you.
I would now like to ask side proposition to give their reply speech.
Adjudicators and the floor at large, I think that it needs to be of utmost importance that we realize what side opposition has come to us here with today. Now, in the beginning of my speech, I very clearly mentioned our implementation process, I mentioned the funding, I mentioned how people would get the money, I mentioned all things regarding to the implementation, and then still admitted that while we can have these thoughts in mind, this is largely conceptual. So we need to argue this on a principle level. And what our entire opposition has brought to us for the entirety of this debate is about implementation. The reason why they spoke about a utopia that we live in, and this was one of the clashes, the reason why they spoke about us living in a utopia, the reason why it would not be affordable, everything, is because of the fact that this is all they have. The only thing that they have is implementation. Now, I'd like to go through all the clashes of this debate, one of them obviously being implementation. The second one being their opposite counterprop. So they told us how we shouldn't be doing UBI, and their solution to this was having a targeted system that works to give money to specific people. Yet they agreed to the fact that social welfare doesn't work as good as it could, as it can. They agreed that currently getting that money in the first place is also a bit difficult. So tell me, what is inherently different from that social welfare to your targeted, to the targeted money that you will be giving out to other people? Another point on this clash of their supposed counterprop was the idea that if you're going to have a counterprop, you're supposed to have something that is different to ours. The only thing that they suggested that was different to ours was that the fact that it was going to be targeted, which I already said under the main clash, was the fact that it's the same as social welfare. Whereas we did our job, we told you our burden of proof, we proved our burden of proof, and we proved further than implementation-wise why we would institute UBI. For these reasons, I think that this motion should do nothing but stand. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming. I thought that was a very interesting debate, and I was quite happy that we could have it despite the circumstances that we're still in. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you have a wonderful day.